Coming to you live from Washington, D.C., just hours after the presidential election. Welcome back to the Week 10 Other Fantasy Guys Weekly Matchup Show. This week, I actually pleased to announce that I have a couple special guests with me. Live at the presidential election, I do have Governor Romney, and I do have our new president, President Barack Obama. They've been kind enough to come on my show and allow me to ask them a few questions right after this great election. The first question I have for you, Governor Romney, is you usually wear a red tie in your speeches.
I always wear red ties.
Oh, okay, right. And what my question is I'm wondering why not a blue tie or a green tie?
Well, the special silk Indian tie imported that I order is $20,000 for the blue tie. The red tie is $17,000.
Okay.
$20,000 is too much to spend on a tie.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. President Obama, after you found out that you had won this election, how does it feel winning?
Well, it actually feels good knowing this guy didn't win.
All right. And my next question to you, obviously, you lost this election, Governor Romney. How does it feel losing this election?
Well, I actually feel pretty good, Professor.
Okay, all right. I'm President Obama. Tell America and my viewers, what is your first plan of action?
Well, America and his viewers, I'd say my first plan of action would be to take a vacation.
All right. And Governor Romney, I understand you brought a concession speech that you prepared for my viewers.
Oh, yeah. No, it seems I left it. If you like, I could have one of my many secretaries go get it. Maybe Jessica.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for that. I'm sorry. President Obama, my last question for you is, once you found out that you had won, what was the first thing that you said to your wife, Michelle?
The very first thing that I said to Michelle would be, we're going to get it on tonight.
Okay, all right. And the last thing, in case you guys want to take a few moments and just thank some of the people out there for making everything happen for you. Governor Romney, if you'd like to say a few thanks.
Well, first of all, Professor, I'd like to thank you and the fantasy guys for having me on. I'd like to thank President Obama for sucking.
All right.
I'd like to thank my mom. I'd like to thank all of my supporters and most of all the voters that let me down.
Oh,
and that would be all.
All right. And President Obama, anybody you'd like to thank?
Well, I'd like to thank you guys most of all.
You're welcome.
I'd like to thank Linda, Joe, Tim, Rick.
Okay.
I'd also like to thank Erica and Jessica. Yes.
It seems like this may take a while, so we're going to have to get back with the president later in this show. The Professor from Washington, D.C. Week 10 matchups. Are you ready? I am. The first matchup we have as Thursday night game is the Indianapolis Colts at the Jacksonville Jaguars. Both of these teams have a fairly soft defense, and to be honest, because of that, they're going to give up some points on the offensive side of the ball. Andrew Luck was amazing last week, throwing for over 400 yards. I really like him against the weak Jaguars defense. Brown at running back, Reggie Wayne, Avery. Honestly, I really like most of the Colts team. On the Jaguar side of the ball, I like Jennings because the Colts run defense is not that strong. Blackman's starting to put on, a little bit of a show the last couple weeks. He's still maybe a flex spot, and that's only if you're in bye weeks. Other than that, nobody else on the Jaguars should get a start. Up next, we have the Oakland Raiders at the Baltimore Ravens. If you watched last week's game with the Raiders against the Bucs, Carson Palmer actually was very impressive, as well as their tight end, Brandon Myers. Now, they are going against a little bit tougher Ravens defense, but the Bucs D is no joke. So, to be honest, I don't think Carson Palmer or Myers will do as well as they did last week, but I do think they'll have slightly above average games, surprisingly, against that Ravens defense. Not a huge fan of McFadden this week. Denarius Moore in a bind on a bye week, I actually think he'll get you some points. And on the Ravens side of the ball, of course, Ray Rice. I actually think Torrey Smith and Anquan Bolden will do well this week. I think the Raiders' pass defense is fairly weak. And Joe Flacco, if your quarterback's on a bye week, he might get a start this week on your team. Up next, we have the Denver Broncos at the Carolina Panthers. If you've seen what the Broncos have done lately with Peyton Manning running that offense, you've got to like their passing game. That means you've got to like Eric Decker. You've got to like Demaryius Thomas. Even their tight end, Tammy's been getting in on some action. Willis McGahee is a huge beneficiary of Peyton Manning's, great play. It makes him better because they have to defend against the pass, which means when he audibles to that run, McGahee gets yards. Panthers give up some points to the running back position, so I actually look for McGahee to have an above-average game as well. Cam Newton going against a tough Broncos defense. He outplayed RG3 last week. We'll have to see what he does this week against that tough defense. I think he'll do average at best. I don't like any of the running backs on the Panthers. Tough Broncos run defense, tough pass defense. To be honest, maybe surprisingly, I actually like Greg Olsen this week at the tight end position. I think he might be one of the only stars on Carolina's side. That brings us to the New York Giants at the Cincinnati Bengals. Both teams play some tough defense. However, on the Bengals side of the ball, they have a fairly potent offense with Dalton, A.J. Green, and even that little guy Hawkins will score you some points if you need him on a bye week. Jermaine Gresham dropped a few balls last week, against the Giants defense. I think they'll need him. I actually think he's going to score above average points. I'm not a huge fan of Ben Jarvis, Green Ellis this week just because that Giants run defense is pretty tough. On the Giants side of the ball, Eli Manning was horrible last week against a tough Steeler defense. I like him a little bit better against the Bengals, but I don't think he's going to have that high of an above-average game. Not a huge fan of the running back game in New York right now. And, Eli will get some points. Maybe if you're lucky, they'll fall behind, and that means they'll have to throw, and Hakeem Nicks and Victor Cruz and Martellus Bennett may score you some extra points that way. But I don't see really any of the Giants receivers, going crazy this week. And now we have the Tennessee Titans and the Miami Dolphins. On the Tennessee side of the ball, yes, Chris Johnson scored you some points last week because he had a garbage time touchdown run. With Washington, honestly, there's not too much to like. Last week they got smashed by a tough Bears D. The Dolphins D is actually, they're not as good, but they're still a very good defense. For that, I really only like maybe Nate Washington if you're in a bind, and Kendall Wright if you're in a bind. Just because they'll probably be behind. They're going to have to throw, even though their passing game's not that good. Somehow they're going to score some points, but you only start those guys really if you're in a bye-week bind. On the Dolphins side of the ball, Reggie Bush is, becoming healthy again. He scored a couple touchdowns recently. He's getting back on track. If you're in a quarterback bye-week blind, Ryan Tannehill, he's actually starting to develop a good relationship between Hartline and Best. You may start him if you are weak at the quarterback position this week. And that brings us to the Detroit Lions at the Minnesota Vikings. Last week you saw Adrian Peterson run like a maniac against the Lions. They're not a soft defense, but neither is the Seahawks. So Adrian Peterson, I anticipate him to have another strong game. As for the rest of the Vikings, Adrian Peterson will have to have a strong game because I really don't like, too much else. Christian Ponder has not been very good the last few weeks, made some bad decisions. You can't really like any of his receivers. Kyle Rudolph the last 3 or 4 weeks has been, getting colder and colder. And on the Lions side of the ball, the Vikings have a fairly weak pass defense. I like Stafford. I like Calvin Johnson. Even Titus Young if you're in a bye-week bind where you need somebody to fill in for a wide receiver position. And I even like Pettigrew this week as well. And with the presidential election going on, we're going to get a little patriotic right now with the Buffalo Bills at the New England Patriots. In this game against a weak Buffalo Bills defense, really, if you have some Patriots, I guess my theme would be start them if you got them. I like Brady, Ridley, Welker, even Brandon Lloyd, of course, Gronkowski. Pretty much anybody against that weak Bills defense, there will be some points scored this week, definitely. Now, because of that, the Bills are going to be in a hole. They're going to have to throw in order to get back in the game and, try to make it a competitive game. So, surprisingly, I actually like Fitzpatrick this week. Yeah, he'll probably have a couple turnovers, but I think he'll score above average points. And Stevie Johnson. Somehow they're going to have to find a way to get that passing game going in order to keep up with those Patriots. I actually think both of them will have above average points. And that brings us to our shootout of the week, which is going to be the Atlanta Falcons at the New Orleans Saints. Matt Ryan, Drew Brees, Michael Turner, Julio Jones, Roddy White, Marcus Colston, even Lance Moore. I mean, how do you not like almost any of these guys on the Falcons, on the Saints? There's going to be some points scored. The only thing I'm not a huge fan of is really any of the Saints running backs because they don't get the ball enough. You know, they split carries way too much. You know, Tony Gonzalez, Jimmy Graham in the tight end position, both of them I think are going to do well. I really think there's going to be a lot of points scored in this game. Honestly, I especially like Michael Turner. If you saw the Saints run defense last week, you'd like Michael Turner this week too. And that brings us to the San Diego Chargers at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. On the Bucs side of the ball over the last few weeks, they've actually been impressive as an offense. Their defenses look good as well. But, you know, Josh Freeman, and obviously if you watch the last couple weeks, Doug Martin has been amazing. He put like 50 points on the board last week, which, I mean, is unheard of. Anyways, Vincent Jackson, Mike Williams, they've been developing a great rapport with Freeman. You know, I really like against the Chargers defense, and the Chargers have a good defense, but I actually like most of the Bucs players. They're very well-rounded. On the Chargers side of the ball, the Bucs defense is pretty good. Phillip Rivers has really been overrated this season. You know, I'm not liking him. Ryan Matthews will have to get involved in the passing game, and if he does, I really only think he's going to score average points at best. And on their receiving side of the ball, they've got a couple new guys since Meacham's been out, and it's really tough to say. Malcolm Floyd's probably the only one that you may give a start to. Our next matchup we have for you is the New York Jets at the Seattle Seahawks. The professor has one rule this year, and it's if you own somebody on the Jets, you most likely should cut them and sign somebody else out of free agency. You know, and his second rule is don't start any of the Jets if they're playing against a tough Seahawks defense. So as far as the Jet side of the ball, there's really nothing to like. Sean Green, maybe if you're in a bind, only because last week Adrian Peterson did run all over the Seahawks defense. So maybe you give him the start. Seahawks side of the ball, Russell Wilson and Sidney Rice last week looked pretty impressive. Yes, it's a weaker Minnesota Vikings defense. The Jets are a little bit better, but they're a little banged up. So I actually think Marshawn Lynch is going to do well. I think Russell Wilson and Sidney Rice will all be above average. Up next, we have the Dallas Cowboys at the Philadelphia Eagles. If you watched Philly's game last week and you saw that their defense is not that strong, I really actually like most of the Cowboys this week. Romo, a running back position, which should be Jones filling in for an injured DeMarco Murray. Even Dez Bryant, as long as he's healthy, and Miles Austin, even Jason Witten. The Eagles just seemed like they couldn't stop anybody last week. Now, yes, Tony Romo's no Drew Brees, but the Eagles' defense is that bad. As far as the other side of the ball and the Eagles, Michael Vick, and they will be chasing the Cowboys. I think they're going to be down, so they're going to have to throw. That will mean McCoy will get involved in the pass game. I like Deshaun Jackson. I think he'll have slightly above average points. I don't like him that much. And Michael Vick should have average points at best. And now we have the St. Louis Rams at the San Francisco 49ers. The professor has one rule this year in fantasy football, and that is do not start anybody on your team if they are going up against that tough San Francisco 49er defense. So that means as far as the Rams side of the ball, that's right. I really don't like any of them. Not a Bradford, not a Jackson. I don't like any of the Rams. The 49ers side of the ball, I think Alex Smith will do okay, but I don't think he's going to be a viable option for you. The Rams defense is pretty tough as well, but I do like Frank Gore, and I think Crabtree, he gets a lot of targets. I think he will score you above average points. Vernon Davis should get a touchdown this week. He should have above average points. And also, you always got to look at starting that San Francisco defense. Our next matchup is the Houston Texans at the Chicago Bears. I am excited for this matchup. Tell me, does this look like an excited professor's face? It is. This matchup is going to be great. You've got Matt Schaub versus Jay Cutler. You've got Arian Foster versus Matt Forte. Andre Johnson versus Brandon Marshall. I mean, top-tier running backs, receivers, quarterbacks, top-tier defenses. I'm not sure who's going to win out. Is it going to be the offense? Is it going to be the defense? The Bears' defense looked tough last week. The Texans' defense has been tough all year. Honestly, I actually think defense is going to win out a little bit. So each of those guys that I said I'm excited to see, don't plan on them having above-average games. And finishing up with our Monday night matchup, it is the Kansas City Chiefs at the Pittsburgh Steelers. You know, Big Ben on the Steelers side of the ball, Antonio Brown, Mike Wallace, Heath Miller. I do like those guys against a very weak Kansas City defense. I don't really like any of their running backs. There's just too many of them to go around. On the Chiefs side of the ball, I am a huge fan of actually Dwayne Bowe this week because he is just featured in like every play. You know, Jamal Charles against a tough Steelers defense, you probably got to start him if you got him, but don't count on him doing too much. The referees took time off at the beginning of the year. The NFL says that players need to take time off in the middle of the year. And that means the Cardinals, Browns, Packers, and Redskins are all on a bye week, which brings us to the bye week blitz. So if you're looking for, you know, one of these positions that you have that is missing now because of a bye week, a quarterback, running back, or receiver, these are a few people that are probably available on your waiver wire in free agency that you could pick up and maybe steal a win this week in your fantasy league. At the quarterback position, some players that may be available that I like this week is Ryan Tannehill. Hasselbeck, surprisingly, I think they're going to be behind, so I think he's going to have to throw a ton. So I actually think he'll score above average points. And the same story with Fitzpatrick. I think they're going to be behind. He's going to have to throw because he throws a lot to get them back in the game. He's going to have above average points. The running back position, you know, it's probably not much available on your waiver wire, so you may have to even get somebody, a backup somewhere. Someone like a Marcel Reese, who, you know, the Raiders should have a fairly strong running showing this week, so Marcel Reese might do well, as well as Isaac Redman from Pittsburgh. With all the injuries and everything going on there, their three-headed monster, he seems to be the one getting the ball the most and reliable, so he actually may be available in your free agency. At the wide receiver position, I actually like Devon Best from the Dolphins, Lance Moore from the Saints, and you know, Justin Blackmon has been coming on a little bit. He scored a touchdown last week. The Jaguars probably are going to be behind. They're probably going to have to throw, which means Blackmon could get involved in that offense and should score you some points. The tight end position, you know, Brandon Myers, you know, I picked him last week. I'm going to pick him again this week. Last week he put up over 20 points. And Dreesen in Denver. And I also like Fasano in Miami. I think, you know, with them and the team and the matchup they have, I think he's going to put up above average points.
Rejoining presidential interview live in progress.
I'd like to thank the lady with the donkey named Franco and America mostly. I'd like to thank your mom. Well, for her vote, of course.
All right. Well, Governor Romney and President Obama, you know, I really appreciate you guys coming on my show. You know, thanks for joining me. It was a pleasure having you. You know, coming to you live from Washington, D.C., the presidential elections. Tune in next week in Week 11, and if you do have a question for next week's matchup, make sure that you post that question in our comment box below, and we will answer it in next week's episode. As always, like this video, subscribe to our channel for future updates, and follow us on Twitter. Tune in next week where I will show you how to make a great pair of UV-rated ski goggles out of some old Q-tips, a tumbleweed, and a hummingbird feeder.
I am Barack Obama, and I approve this message. And Mitt Romney, not so bad.